Subject 0. Chapter 1. The Geometry of Silence. The city was a bruise turning purple at the edges of the horizon. It wasn't the beautiful, bruised purple of twilight, but the deep, dull color of old injury. Elias called it the Great Hush. He'd been calling it that for 6 months, ever since the construction cranes froze on their ascent and the ambient roar of a million lives dropped into a soft, unnerving static. He sat on a folding chair in his apartment, 19 floors above the hush, with a pair of antique opera glasses pressed to his eyes. His view stretched over Manhattan, a grid of canyons where the wind now whistled notes of abandonment. The glass of the high-rises reflected a sun that felt too bright, too indifferent to the stilled world below. Elias was hunting, not for food or answers, but for the tiniest flicker of an anomaly in the perfect, dreadful pattern. His apartment used to be a chaos of art, books, and half-finished sculptures. Now, it was stripped bare, almost monastic. He'd sold off the clutter, piece by laborious piece, trading sentimentality for utility and space. A single canvas, stark white and unframed, leaned against the wall where a Rothko once hung. It was his metaphor for the current age, a terrifying blank slate. The air conditioning unit in the wall rattled, a sound so familiar it was nearly invisible, but now it felt like a tiny percussion section in a massive, empty concert hall. Elias lowered the opera glasses. The rubber casing was warm from his grip. He rubbed the slight indentation the bridge had left on his nose, a habit he hadn't shaken since childhood. "Nothing, is there?" a voice said from behind him. Elias didn't jump. He rarely did anymore. He knew the precise moment Sarah entered a room. It was in the almost imperceptible shift of air pressure. She was standing by the salvaged industrial refrigerator, pouring herself a glass of water that had been filtered 4 times. She looked impossibly tired, yet perpetually prepared. "The usual nothing," he confirmed, not turning around. "Just the wind experimenting with harmonics in the vacant skyscrapers. This city used to scream, now it just sighs." Sarah walked over, her worn boots silent on the bare concrete floor. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, a brief, anchoring weight. Her fingers were cool. She didn't press for a conversation he wasn't ready for, which was one of the many reasons their fragile arrangement endured. "The radio crackled this morning," she said quietly. "A single burst, maybe 2 seconds. Static, then a high-pitched tone, gone before I could get a lock on the frequency." Elias swiveled the chair to face her. His eyes, the color of sea glass, narrowed with an intensity that could cut. This was the news he was always waiting for, a break in the silence. The Great Hush wasn't just a lack of noise. It was an absence of all communication, all broadcast, all digital heartbeat. Tone, not speech. Not Morse, he pressed. She shook her head, the movement tight and economical. Too quick. But it wasn't natural. It was engineered noise, Elias. And it came from the west side, near the old Chelsea station. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise startled him. He hated unnecessary noise. He hated the way a sudden sound could make the silence feel even heavier, like a lead blanket being dropped. "Chelsea," he repeated, pacing the short distance to the large, empty kitchen island. "That's 8 blocks. We agreed to stay put, to conserve the batteries, to not make unnecessary moves." "We agreed to survive," Sarah countered, leaning back against the refrigerator. "And we agreed that an authentic signal changes the rules. That station runs deep. It has decommissioned tunnels leading all the way to the river. If someone is broadcasting, even a mistake, they've found a shielded space. And they're trying to reach out." A moment of pure, raw excitement flashed across Elias's face, quickly masked by the analytical frown he wore almost constantly. He ran his hand over his close-cropped hair, feeling the faint stubble. 6 months of silence had worn them both down, but the prospect of a single, meaningful sound was a drug. He walked to the utility wall, a complex, Bespoke array of battery packs and solar regulators hummed softly there, the true engine of their survival. They had power, limited but reliable. They had water and enough dried goods to last another year if they were careful. But they lacked purpose. "It's a fool's errand, possibly a trap," Elias murmured, pulling a compact trauma kit from a secure wall panel. "But an unanswered signal is a scar on the canvas. And I'm a man who hates flaws in the pattern." Sarah pushed off the refrigerator. She didn't need to ask if he was going. She had been the one to introduce the variable. Her preparation was already evident. She had her worn, military-style backpack slung over her shoulder, containing their most precious tools: the powerful, low-frequency radio receiver and a sealed, leather-bound journal. "I'm coming with you," she stated, her voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "You can track the source, but I can read the electromagnetic signature. 2 people double the odds of success. They also have the resources." Elias looked at her. Her face was a study in resolve, her eyes fixed on his with a challenge he understood completely. In the old world, their relationship had been a volatile mix of intellectual rivalry and shared passions. In the great hush, it was pure, lean synchronicity. They were the cogs in a single, complicated clock. "Fine," he conceded, pulling on a light, graphite-colored jacket. "But we move fast. We use the lower avenues. We stay out of the open squares. And we don't engage with anything that moves." "Are the locks secured?" "Triple bolted, timer set," she confirmed. "If we're not back by 0300, the final seal drops. Nobody gets in or out." He nodded, a sharp, decisive gesture. It was a cold comfort, knowing their haven would wait for them, a solid thing in a fluid world. He picked up his primary tool, a heavy, black, custom-built radio detector that resembled a slightly futuristic Geiger counter. It was his divining rod for the truth. The descent was unnerving. They took the stairs, 19 flights of them, not trusting the old elevator and wanting to preserve the battery life. The stairwell smelled of stale concrete and the faint, sweet scent of decay. Their footfalls echoed up and down the empty shaft, a rhythmic drumming that felt too loud, too insistent. When they reached the lobby, they paused, crouching behind the granite reception desk. The main doors were glass, shattered in a lazy, radial pattern months ago, now taped with heavy-duty plastic sheeting. The city's stillness pressed against the thin barrier. "Hold your breath for a count of 10, Elias whispered, his voice a low vibration. "Let your ears adjust to the street noise, if there is any." They waited. The city outside offered only the faintest murmur of the wind, rustling plastic and loose metal. The silence felt active, like a physical presence pressing against their eardrums. Sarah used a small, silent tool to slice a clean, narrow slit in the plastic sheeting. Elias slipped through first, his detector held low and ready. The air hit him, cool, clean, and smelling of ozone and the damp earth pushing up through cracks in the sidewalk. The streets were an open tomb. The cars were the worst part. They were everywhere, frozen mid-motion, creating accidental sculptures of haste and confusion. A yellow cab was wedged halfway into a hot dog stand. A delivery van sat abandoned with its doors flung open, its contents, stacks of outdated magazines, scattered like fallen leaves. They moved with practiced, efficient silence, hugging the shadows of the buildings. Elias scanned constantly, his detector a silent promise of direction. The signal, if it was real, was still too weak to register, lost in the normal background radiation of the dead city. They walked 8 blocks, a journey that had once taken 5 minutes and now took almost 30 of careful, tense movement. The sun was dipping, painting the western sky in angry streaks of orange and crimson. The shadows were growing long, distorting the shapes of the abandoned vehicles into menacing sentinels. At the intersection of 22nd Street, they stopped. The old Chelsea train station entrance was ahead, a squat, stone building nestled between a shuttered art gallery and an empty laundromat. The heavy metal doors were partially ajar, held open by a crumbling concrete barrier that had fallen from the roof. "The source?" Sarah breathed, pointing to her backpack. She activated the receiver. A thin, wavering green line appeared on the screen, oscillating slightly. It centered, deep beneath that station. The tone was real, Elias. "It's here." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and electric. The moment he'd rehearsed in his mind countless times was finally here. The great hush was about to be broken, or perhaps simply explained. He approached the station entrance, his footsteps crunching on loose gravel. "Wait," Sarah warned, her hand darting out to grab his sleeve. "Something else. Look at the wall." She was pointing to the grimy stone facade of the station building. Spray painted in thick, black script, covering an old, faded advertisement, was a single, stark word. It was fresh. The paint was thick, still possessing a slight, wet sheen. The word was echo. They looked at the word, then at each other. The silence of the city seemed to amplify the single, bold statement. It was a message deliberately left, a warning or an invitation. It was too specific, too perfectly positioned to be random vandalism. "It wasn't just a broadcast," Elias whispered, his eyes fixed on the word. "It was a response to the silence. Someone down there knows what the hush is, and they've named it." He pushed his sleeve up, revealing a small, faint scar on his inner wrist, a relic of a past he rarely acknowledged. He took a deep, steadying breath, then pushed the station door further open. A rush of cold, damp air, smelling of deep earth and iron, escaped from the darkness. The detector in his hand began to chirp, a low, quick pulse, the frequency matching the signal on Sarah's screen. "We go down," he said, his voice flat with resolve. "But we go down knowing this isn't just a research trip anymore. This is a confrontation." He stepped across the threshold, into the absolute, waiting blackness of the stairwell leading down. Sarah followed, pulling a high-powered flashlight from her pack and clicking it on. The narrow beam sliced through the dust-filled air, revealing the first few wet, moss-covered steps. "I'm ready for the conversation," Sarah muttered, her voice echoing strangely in the stone shaft. The last thing Elias saw before the door swung shut behind them, plunging them into utter darkness, was the single, perfect word on the wall, echo. And as the first step creaked under his weight, he knew one thing with chilling certainty. The sound they heard wasn't a distress call. It was a summons. Chapter 2. The Cartography of Fear. The air in the stairwell was thick enough to chew. It tasted of old rust, standing water, and something acrid. Maybe ozone, maybe old fear. Elias led the way, his custom detector held out like a divining rod. Its low, rhythmic chirping was the only consistent sound, a synthetic heartbeat in the stone-cold chest of the earth. Sarah's flashlight beam danced across the walls, pulling brief, desperate shapes from the gloom. The stone steps gave way to slick, concrete risers, then to a rough-hewn passage. This wasn't standard station construction. This felt older, forgotten, a secret artery pumping cold air into the city's corpse. "The tone," Elias whispered, stopping abruptly. "It's a continuous wave now. High frequency. It's not just a broadcast, it's a lure. Look at the meter." He angled the detector so Sarah could see the screen. The needle was pegged, throbbing against the upper limit. The signal was overwhelming, impossibly strong for a transmitter 8 blocks away. It felt as though they were walking directly toward the power source. "It's not transmitting from the tunnel," Sarah concluded, her voice tight. "It is the tunnel. The whole structure is acting as a waveguide. It's amplifying the signal, leading us right to it. It's a deliberate design." The realization settled like a cold weight in Elias's stomach. The people who made the noise didn't want to communicate. They wanted to guide them. This wasn't an accident. This was an invitation or a trap meticulously engineered into the forgotten infrastructure. They continued their descent, the passage twisting unexpectedly, defying the rigid grid of Manhattan above. Elias's sense of direction, his internal compass that usually worked flawlessly above ground, began to spin. He felt the unnerving vertigo of being lost in a place that shouldn't exist. The walls were wet, but not with simple condensation. They glistened with a slick, black film that smelled faintly metallic. Sarah ran a gloved finger along it. "It's some kind of mineral seepage," she reported. "High concentrations of iron and manganese. But it's viscous, like oil mixed with dust. And look at the scoring on the rock." The flashlight beam focused on deep, horizontal grooves carved into the stone, running parallel to the floor. They were too uniform, too straight to be natural erosion. They looked like massive friction marks, as if something enormous had been dragged through the passage, or perhaps built here. "Tunneling machinery," Elias suggested, trying to force a rational explanation. "Old mining equipment. They must have expanded this section decades ago and forgotten the plans." "No," Sarah countered, shaking her head sharply. "The grooves stop here. They don't continue around the corner. They start and end abruptly. And look at the height." She pointed the beam high up the wall. Whatever made these cuts was almost 12 feet tall. That wasn't a piece of construction equipment. A profound silence fell between them, broken only by the chirping of the detector. The air seemed to cool instantly. They had entered the true domain of the tunnel, a space entirely separated from the dead city above. The geometry of the passage was unsettling. Perfectly smooth floor, flat walls, and a low, arched ceiling that seemed to press down on them. Suddenly, the floor shifted under Elias's boot. Not a tremor, but a subtle, almost rubbery give. He stopped, holding his breath. "Did you feel that?" he murmured. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "It felt like a joint, like we stepped onto a seam." Elias knelt down, placing the flat of his hand on the floor. It was too smooth to be natural rock or even simple concrete. It had a dull, matte finish, a texture that seemed to absorb the light. He scraped at it with the edge of a salvaged knife. A thin layer peeled back, revealing a dense, dark composite material beneath. "It's not stone," he declared, feeling the cold slickness of the material. "It's artificial. This whole section is fabricated. We're not in a natural cave, Sarah. We're inside a structure." He stood up, looking around with a renewed sense of unease. The low arch of the ceiling no longer felt like a natural constraint, but a deliberate containment. They were in a corridor designed and built by someone or something long ago. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice low and guttural. "Keep the beam steady." They pressed on, the rhythm of their footsteps muffled by the strange floor material. The tunnel opened onto a cavernous space, a massive circular chamber with walls lost to the shadows. It smelled strongly of ozone and burnt insulation. In the center of the chamber, suspended from the ceiling by thick, rusted chains, was a gigantic, metallic sphere. It was maybe 15 feet in diameter, seamless, dark, and utterly featureless. It didn't look like technology. It looked like a moon that had fallen into the earth. The sound, the high-pitched tone, was radiating from the sphere. It vibrated in Elias's chest, a constant, low-level thrum that threatened to crack his teeth. He lowered his detector. It was useless now. The signal was everything, everywhere. "This is it," Sarah breathed, her voice a thin thread of sound. "This is the source. It's generating the tone. But what is it for?" Elias walked slowly toward the sphere, mesmerized by its immense, perfect stillness. He reached out a trembling hand, then stopped a few feet short. The metal radiated a faint but distinct heat. "It's a receiver or a focus point," he theorized, his writer's mind already building the architecture of the impossible. "It's taking in some ambient energy and broadcasting a specific frequency. But the frequency, it feels deliberate, Sarah. It's an irritant. It's designed to annoy the silence." He circled the sphere slowly, his eyes scanning for any seam, panel, or access point. Nothing. It was a perfect piece of engineering, alien in its simplicity. Then he noticed the chains. They weren't simply holding the sphere. They were connected to a series of thick, black cables that ran from the ceiling down to the floor, disappearing into the smooth, artificial material. "Look at the chains," Elias said, pointing his flashlight at the ceiling. "They're grounded. This thing isn't just hanging here. It's drawing power, and it's sending something back into the structure." He crouched, tracing the cables to the floor. The artificial material was slightly raised here, forming a low, circular pedestal around the sphere. And embedded in that pedestal, in a thin, circular script that pulsed with an almost imperceptible reddish glow, was a message. Elias leaned in, holding his breath, translating the unfamiliar symbols in his mind. They weren't any language he recognized, but they were not random. They were mathematical, a complex, looping equation that seemed to describe a wave function. "It's not a language of words," he murmured. "It's a language of physics, and it's stating its purpose." "What does it say, Elias? What is it doing?" Sarah pressed, her receiver dropping to her side, forgotten. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the glowing inscription, his eyes reflecting the soft, red light. The meaning of the equation was chillingly clear. It described the mechanism for dampening all ambient electromagnetic interference, for isolating a physical space from all external signals. "It says," Elias whispered, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth, "that this thing is the hush. Not the cause of the silence, Sarah. It's the device that maintains it. It's protecting something. And it's not designed to communicate. It's designed to listen." He took a step back, the metallic thrumming of the sphere vibrating in his bones. As he did, he realized something even more terrifying. The smooth, seamless surface of the sphere wasn't metal at all. It was a single, flawless, polished lens, reflecting their terrified figures back at them, like two insignificant insects caught in its dark gaze. And then the high-pitched tone cut out. Instantly, completely. The massive silence returned, deeper and heavier than before, suffocating them in the center of the dark chamber. A single second later, the globe moved. It did not spin or swing. It simply tilted, silently, its perfect dark surface turning to face them directly. And a new inscription began to glow beneath their feet. Not the old equation, but a fresh, immediate word, pulsing red in the floor. "You." Chapter 3. The Weight of Recognition. The silence after the tone was not a relief, but a physical blow. It pressed down, heavy and absolute, making the ringing in Elias's ears feel deafening. The massive sphere, now perfectly angled toward them, shimmered in Sarah's flashlight beam. The single, glowing word on the floor, "You," pulsed like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, crimson against the dull composite. "What was that?" Sarah breathed, her voice a thin, reedy sound swallowed almost instantly by the profound quiet. Her hand instinctively went to her sidearm, a small, legal pistol she carried for emergencies, though she hadn't fired it in months. In this place, it felt like a child's toy. Elias shook his head, his mind racing, trying to assimilate the impossible. It stopped transmitting. It recognized us. It changed its message. He felt a primal dread, a cold fear that went deeper than anything he'd known during the hush. They weren't alone. They had been seen. He took a cautious step back, but the glowing words seemed to follow, shifting on the floor, always directly beneath them. The sphere itself remained motionless, a perfect, dark eye observing their every move. The silence amplified the tiniest sounds, the rustle of their clothes, the beat of their own frantic hearts. Then, from the featureless surface of the sphere, a pinpoint of light emerged. It wasn't a reflection. It was an internal emanation, a tiny, intense blue that began to expand, slowly, deliberately, until it formed a perfect, sapphire circle perhaps a foot in diameter. Within this circle, a new image began to form. It was a city street. Not their dead city, but a bustling, vibrant tableau. Cars honked. People walked with purpose. Street vendors shouted. It was New York City before the hush, alive and deafening. And then the image zoomed in, focusing on a specific individual. It was Elias. Younger, a little heavier, laughing freely as he gesticulated wildly during an outdoor cafe conversation. He was animated, vibrant, full of the noise and energy that defined his former life. The image was perfect, crystal clear, as if projected from a memory or an intimate surveillance feed. "My God," Sarah whispered, her flashlight beam wavering. "It's you. How could it?" The image shifted again, seamlessly. Now it was Sarah in a crowded lab, surrounded by glowing screens, intensely focused on a complex diagram. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a stray lock of hair falling across her face. It was a private moment, a snapshot of her professional past. The blue light retracted, coalescing back into the tiny pinpoint, then vanished completely. The sphere was dark once more, silent, impenetrable. The word "you" still glowed beneath their feet, a silent accusation or an unnerving welcome. "It knows us," Elias stated, the words barely a breath. "It has access to the past, to our past. This isn't just a device for the hush, Sarah. This is a record keeper, a collector." A profound chill ran down his spine. The hush wasn't an accident or a natural phenomenon. It was a deliberate act, and the entity behind it had been watching, observing, cataloging their lives, and perhaps the lives of millions. He lifted his detector again, but it remained silent, inert. The sphere had shut down its primary function. It had finished guiding them. Now, it was just present. "What does it want?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with fear. Her pistol remained in her hand, but her arm hung limp, as if the weight of the situation had sapped her strength. "Why show us that? Why bring us here?" "It wants to be found, perhaps," Elias speculated, his mind grasping for theories, for meaning. "Or it wants to observe our reaction to being found. This is a controlled experiment. We are the variables." Suddenly, a low, guttural hum emanated from the sphere. It was not the high-pitched tone from before, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. The chains holding the sphere tautened, creaking under immense strain. The circular pedestal beneath their feet, where the word "you" glowed, began to retract into the floor. The glowing word flickered, then vanished. As the pedestal disappeared, a new section of the floor beneath them began to illuminate, a grid of faint, crisscrossing lines. A section of the circular wall to their left, previously featureless, began to glow with a soft, internal light. A seam appeared, then widened, revealing a narrow, dark opening. It was another tunnel, darker and more foreboding than the one they had just traversed. The hum from the sphere intensified, becoming a low growl. It was a sound of immense power, of something being activated or awakened. The air grew colder, and a faint, acrid smell, like burnt electronics and something organic, began to fill the chamber. "It's showing us the way," Sarah said, her voice a strained whisper. "It's opening a path. It's guiding us deeper." Elias stood frozen, his eyes darting between the menacing sphere and the newly opened passage. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to run back to the surface, to the relative safety of the dead city. But the writer in him, the relentless seeker of narrative truth, found itself captivated. This was a story unfolding in the silent heart of the world, and they were, unwillingly, its protagonists. He looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes held that same fierce resolve he had seen above ground. She was terrified, but she was also a scientist, driven by the hunger for knowledge. They had come for answers, and the sphere was offering them, piece by horrifying piece. "It wants us to continue," Elias said, his voice flat with a chilling certainty. "It wants to show us what it's protecting, or what it's found." He took a step towards the newly opened passage. The hum from the sphere swelled, as if in approval. The air in the passage felt heavy, damp, and smelled of something ancient and disturbed. Sarah caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Elias, what if it's not just showing us a way? What if it's forcing us? What if this is a trap?" He turned to face her, his gaze intense. "It showed us our past, Sarah. It collected it. If it wants to trap us, it could have done so in 1,000 ways before now. It could have never let us get this far. This is deliberate, and I need to know why. Don't you?" He saw the flicker of reluctant agreement in her eyes. The thirst for understanding, for the hidden truth, was a powerful current that ran through them both. It was the very reason they were still alive in the hush. Taking a deep breath, Elias stepped into the newly opened passage. The light from Sarah's flashlight beam was immediately swallowed by the profound darkness. The passage was narrower than the previous one, and the air was stifling. He reached back, his fingers finding Sarah's hand in the gloom. Their clasped hands were a small anchor in the overwhelming unknown. As they moved deeper into the new tunnel, the glowing opening behind them slowly began to shrink. The seam in the wall closed with a faint, metallic groan, sealing them inside. The hum from the sphere faded, replaced by the damp, oppressive quiet of the earth. They were entirely alone now, surrounded by the unknown. Elias squeezed Sarah's hand. Ahead, the darkness felt absolute, a living, breathing entity. But just then, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached them from the depths of the tunnel. It wasn't the high-pitched tone nor the sphere's hum. It was something else. Something soft, rhythmic, and strangely familiar. It sounded like breathing. Chapter 4. The Geometry of Breath. The rhythmic sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the rush of wind, or the drip of water, or the settling of rock. It was the low, steady inhalation and exhalation of a living being. Elias and Sarah froze, their clasped hands tightening in the suffocating darkness of the new passage. The air around them was cold, but where the sound originated, the air felt perceptibly warmer, carrying a faint, dry scent of dust and unwashed cloth. Elias, the writer who made his career analyzing the nuance of sound, realized something crucial. The breathing was regular, almost unnaturally so. It was the breath of someone deeply asleep, or perhaps heavily sedated. "Did you bring the thermal unit?" Elias whispered, his mouth close to Sarah's ear. She nodded tightly against his shoulder, fumbling with the clasp of her backpack. The silence of the tunnel seemed to demand absolute stealth. She extracted a small, handheld thermal imager, a tool usually reserved for identifying heat leaks in their apartment's insulation. She switched it on. The display, normally a riot of bright, colorful heat signatures, remained a dull, uniform blue. Only their own bodies registered as faint, shimmering orange blobs. There was no detectable heat source ahead. "The breathing is right there," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "But the sensor is cold. It's not registering any heat signature. How is that possible?" "Whatever is breathing," Elias murmured, his eyes straining in the absolute darkness. "It's not radiating energy the way a normal body does. Or this whole passage is insulated against thermal transfer." He gently released Sarah's hand and crouched down, placing his ear to the smooth, artificial floor material. The rhythmic sound transmitted clearly through the solid ground, a low, continuous rumble right beneath his cheek. The sound was not distant, it was just around the next bend. He rose and slowly advanced, pressing his back to the cold, damp wall. Sarah followed, training the flashlight beam high and low, searching for any break in the seamless structure. The passage was impossibly straight here, a perfectly engineered conduit that seemed to have no end. They reached a sharp corner. Elias paused, bracing himself against the inevitable confrontation. He signaled to Sarah to kill the light. The absolute darkness returned, heavy and disorienting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, circular mirror salvaged from an old medical kit. He held the mirror low, angling it around the corner, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He waited for 10 long, silent seconds, then slowly, carefully, began to angle the mirror up. The flashlight beam, now held low by Sarah, flickered across the reflected surface. The beam revealed not a monstrous entity, but a person. The figure was sitting against the far wall of a small, alcove-like chamber. It was a man, dressed in heavy, outdated work overalls, his head tilted forward, resting on his chest. He was pale, thin, and entirely motionless. The rhythmic breathing, that deep, unsettling sound, was issuing from his slack, open mouth. "He's alive," Sarah whispered, her voice laced with astonished relief. "He's just sleeping." Elias lowered the mirror and signaled to her to hold the light steady. They moved forward, stepping into the alcove. The man was secured to the wall by heavy leather straps wrapped around his wrists and ankles. The straps were not tight enough to cause injury, but secure enough to prevent escape. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a laborer. Beside him, leaning against the wall, was a tarnished metal toolbox. Elias approached him slowly, cautiously, taking in the scene. There were no visible signs of injury or struggle. "He's been here for a while," Elias observed, noting the light dust covering the man's shoulders and the unnatural pallor of his skin. "The breathing is too deep, too slow. This isn't normal sleep. He's under some kind of deep anesthetic." Sarah knelt down, examining the man's restraints. The leather is old, but the buckles are modern. They've been deliberately secured. He wasn't tied up against his will. He was set in place. Elias reached out, hesitant, and gently brushed the man's forehead. His skin was cool, almost cold to the touch, explaining the thermal unit's failure. He pulled back his hand and focused on the man's chest. Under the heavy overalls, he could see the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his ribs, the slow, clockwork rhythm of his breath. He reached for the metallic toolbox. It wasn't locked. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of heavy foam, were several items that made his blood run cold. The first was a small, high-quality audio recorder, the kind used for precision field recording, its record, light glowing faintly red, indicating it was operational and had been running for a long time. Next to it was a worn, leather-bound notebook filled with meticulously neat handwriting. But the centerpiece, lying atop the foam, was a photograph. It was an old, faded print, the corners curled with age. It showed a younger Elias and Sarah standing together at a crowded, bustling outdoor event, their arms linked, both smiling into the camera. It was the same image, slightly wider, that the sphere had shown them moments ago. Elias picked up the photograph, his fingers trembling. This was not surveillance footage. This was a personal artifact. This man, the sleeping laborer, was somehow connected to the entity that had collected their memories. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes wide with fear and comprehension. "He's an observer," she whispered. "He's the one who was recording the hush. He was the one who left the word echo on the surface. And he had our picture. He was studying us." Elias flipped open the notebook. The script was technical, detailing measurements of silence, fluctuations in ambient pressure, and complex sonic equations. But on the very last page, written in a different, heavier hand, was a single, stark entry. $01:42:00. Subject 0 has arrived. The lure is successful. I am now entering the phase of non-interference. The next stage of the geometry must commence. The breath must be maintained. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool tunnel air. Subject 0. That was them. He looked down at the man, so placid in his enforced sleep, and then back at the ominous text. This was a plan, a terrible, beautiful narrative of which they were the reluctant stars. He's not a prisoner, Elias concluded, slowly closing the notebook. He was the gatekeeper. He initiated the lure and then shut himself down, preserving the breath, waiting for us to find him. As if triggered by his words, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot and focused on Elias with an immediate, terrifying lucidity. The deep, rhythmic breathing did not stop. It continued, unnerving and constant. The man's mouth remained slack, but a sound issued forth, a raspy, weak whisper that still managed to carry through the oppressive quiet. The signal is not the silence. The signal is the geometry. Did you bring the key? Chapter 5. The calculus of the key. The question hung in the air like a sliver of ice. The signal is the geometry. Did you bring the key? Elias stared down at the man, the self-appointed gatekeeper. The man's eyes, wide and unervingly clear, held no trace of sleep, yet the mechanical, deep breathing continued, a stark contradiction. His mouth remained slack, barely moving to form the raspy words. "What key?" Elias demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. He took a half-step toward the man, his detective's instincts overriding his fear. "What did you do? Why did you trap yourself here?" The gatekeeper didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His gaze seemed to bore through Elias, focusing on something behind him, perhaps the memory sphere in the chamber they had just left. The constant, slow huff-huff of his breath was the only answer. Sarah quickly placed the toolbox back on the floor, her mind already shifting from analysis to survival. "He's not communicating, Elias. He's delivering a pre-recorded message. This isn't dialogue, it's a trigger response." She knelt, pointing to a small, almost invisible wire running from the back of the man's neck, disappearing into his overalls. "It's a low-voltage neural implant. The sphere must have sent a coded pulse through the floor when we entered, activating this loop." The man's lips stretched slightly, forming a painful, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He repeated the message, his voice a fraction louder this time, tinged with a hollow echo. "The signal is the geometry. Did you bring the key?" Elias stepped back, a profound sense of horror washing over him. The gatekeeper wasn't a person anymore. He was a biological answering machine, a final, terrifying piece of the geometry itself. Elias glanced down at the old photograph in his hand, the image of their former, noisy lives. If the signal is the geometry, Elias theorized aloud, his mind racing to break the code, then the key must be the thing that breaks the pattern. Something from the noise. Something we possess. He looked at his tools, the inert radio detector, a useless divining rod in this magnetic field. He looked at Sarah's backpack, the thermal imager, the surgical kit, the field journal. None of it felt like a key. It felt like clutter. "Think," Sarah urged, her voice low and frantic. "What did we bring from the surface that is unique? That is not a tool. Something from our lives that the hush could not capture." Elias's eyes fell on his inner jacket pocket, where he kept his single remaining personal indulgence, a slim, antique silver locket. It held a single, micro-engraved sentence, the opening line of the novel that had won him the Pulitzer, a quote about the fragile nature of connection. He pulled it out, the cold metal warm against his palm. It was the only object in his possession not related to survival or research. He held it up, questioning, to the unblinking gatekeeper. The man's mechanical breathing suddenly accelerated. The slow huff-huff quickened into a frantic, shallow pant. The neural implant was clearly registering the object, the anomaly. The man's head snapped up. His eyes locked on the locket, and a new, terrible sound tore from his throat. Not a whisper, but a harsh, grating laugh, entirely devoid of joy. The ornament. The pattern breaker. The gatekeeper rasped, his voice dissolving into a wet cough. "Now the payment." The laugh cut short. The man's chest stopped moving. The slow, rhythmic breathing, the breath that had been maintained, ceased entirely. A final, absolute silence descended upon the alcove, more terrifying than any mechanical hum. At that same moment, a high-pitched whine began to emanate not from the gatekeeper, but from the metal toolbox beside him. A panel on the side of the box slid open with a soft hiss. Within the exposed compartment, a cluster of thin, sharp wires began to vibrate. They were connected to a small, cube-shaped object that pulsed with a faint, malevolent red light. It wasn't a key, it was a trigger. Trap. Now, Elias yelled, shoving Sarah hard toward the main tunnel. He threw himself backward, shielding the space with his body, just as the cube object detonated with a sharp, crackling sound. It wasn't an explosive blast, but a directed energy pulse. A powerful, burning arc of static electricity slammed into the spot where Elias had been standing a moment before, vaporizing the air. The pulse ripped through the space, slamming into the opposite wall and leaving a deep, smoking gouge in the composite material. The stench of burnt ozone-infused rock was immediate and suffocating. Sarah scrambled up, pulling Elias to his feet. His ears were ringing violently, and his arm felt numb where the static field had brushed past him. The gatekeeper remained slack against the wall, but his clothes were now smoldering faintly where the pulse had passed inches from his chest. They used him as bait. Sarah shouted over the ringing in her ears, her eyes wide with shock. They wanted the key, and then they wanted to eliminate the variable. No time. Elias gasped, adrenaline surging through him. The sphere knows we're here. It knows we have the locket. It won't stop. They scrambled back into the narrow tunnel, running blindly, driven by panic and instinct. The smooth floor, which had felt so alien moments before, was now slick beneath their boots. They ran for maybe 20 seconds before the smooth floor beneath their feet suddenly groaned and began to move. The perfectly straight tunnel was no longer straight. The walls and floor were shifting, the composite sections grinding against each other with a sound like tearing metal. The floor tilted sharply beneath them, throwing them off balance. They slid down the incline, crashing against the damp wall. They weren't in a tunnel anymore. They were in a chute. The metallic grinding intensified, shaking the very earth. Sarah screamed as she slid past Elias, her backpack snagging on a jutting piece of rock. The geometry is changing, Elias shouted, fighting the slope, his fingers clawing for purchase. It's sealing off the path behind us. We're being redirected. They tumbled into the profound darkness at the bottom of the incline, landing hard on a cold, wet surface. The grinding stopped instantly, plunging the space back into suffocating silence. Elias was on his back, winded, tasting blood and iron. Sarah groaned beside him. He fumbled for his small, emergency light and flicked it on. The weak beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a cavern far vaster than the sphere chamber. This space was enormous, and it was filled with water, a massive, underground reservoir that stretched into an echoing, black distance. They were trapped on a narrow, slick ledge of rock, the black, still water lapping just below their feet. And in the center of the water, resting on a barely submerged structure, was a faint, steady red light, bobbing gently. It was the only break in the darkness. It wasn't the sphere. It was something small, silent, and entirely new. The key is gone, Elias whispered, staring at the distant light. But the geometry has a new chapter. He reached out a hand to Sarah, his face grim. We need to find out what that thing is.